I'd like to welcome Christopher Corbin, coordinator of the Cartagena Convention Secretariat for the United Nations Environment Programme in the Caribbean. Welcome, Chris, to this discussion that is a preface, really, to the second or third part of our Black to Blue programme for chemicals.
Thank you so much, Charles. Thanks for having me and looking forward to continuing the dialogue.
So let's begin, Chris, if we can, with asking simply what the Cartagena Convention is and why you felt, or why the United Nations Environment Programme felt it was necessary to set the convention up.
Well, the Cartagena Convention currently is still the only legally binding regional agreement for protection of the Caribbean Sea. And it was set up as a legal framework to support one of the 18 regional seas programs that exist globally. And this one covers all of the countries of the wider Caribbean region which border the Caribbean Sea. And when it was established, it really was established in response to the demands by the countries themselves that recognized that the Caribbean Sea was essential for the long-term economic and social development of the region, whether it be for tourism, fisheries, maritime transportation, and actually was triggered by a fairly significant pollution event, an oil spill that took place in the southern Caribbean region that made the countries come together and request of UNEP, please, can you help us develop a regional seas program for the Caribbean? This later evolved into the Cartagena Convention and the Oil Spills Agreement. 10 years later, we then developed the agreement focusing directly on land-based sources of marine pollution, and then one focusing on specially protected areas and wildlife. So those are the pillars, so to speak, of the convention that we work with governments to help implement.
So tell us a little bit about the program around land-based sources of marine pollution and what that focuses on, and in particular, how the different countries of the convention work together and in particular share data around land-based sources of pollution.
Thanks so much, Charles. And this is really a very, very critical element. When the protocol was developed, it really was based on the fact that 75-80% of pollution affecting the Caribbean Sea, dare I say affecting globally, comes from land-based sources and activities. And therefore, the interventions that are needed to control, prevent, and reduce pollution inevitably are going to need to involve specific actions on the ground at national level, but also recognizing that pollution moves, and therefore there needs to be some level of cooperation among countries in order to address land-based sources of marine pollution. When the protocol was developed, it identified two major priority sources. One from agrochemical runoff, mainly fertilizers, nutrients, etc., and one from domestic wastewater or sewage, with the recognition that I would say even up to now, 75-80% of sewage enters the marine environment partially or completely untreated. This really now, for effective action to take place through the protocol, through the convention, we recognize that there was a need for gathering data both on the sources of pollution, but also on their environmental and human health impacts. And there I say there comes some of the challenges, because in a region like the Caribbean, you are talking about 28 governments who've signed on to the convention. You are talking about a variety of capacities, including small islands, continental countries, developed countries, and then finding a system where you both want to identify what are the critical sources of data that need to be captured from the countries, how can then be pulled into giving a more regional analysis of the problem, and then I think most importantly, transforming that data into information that can then inform responses by the governments themselves. The convention actually requires governments to report on activities being taken to address pollution. That I would say is the easiest one, where they report on new laws, new policies, new regulations that they are developing. Where it becomes a bit more challenging is the actual pollutant data. how much pollutant is actually present in the marine environment because there's more sensitivity around that data. There are also more challenges in terms of how was that data collected? Was it done through a harmonized methodology? Are we comparing oranges and not oranges and apples? So what we have had to do as a secretariat is invest a lot of time in building the capacity of countries, working with institutes, working with universities and research organizations to help build a certain level of capacity that would allow that data to be generated, to be accessed, and I think even then, more importantly, to be used.
And just briefly, how has that worked out? How have you been able to draw all of that data together, given the challenges that you've just outlined?
Well, something we are very proud of as a region is that in 2019, we developed our first State of Marine Pollution report for the Caribbean Sea. And unlike previous reports that were based on models and projections, this was a report that for the first time was based on actual data being received from the countries. So the first step was actually agreeing with the government, sitting down and spending many late hours agreeing on what were those indicators, those pollution targets and indicators that we want to be able to monitor, to be able to set a baseline. And in fact, this year, I'm supposed to be initiating the second iteration of that report so that we can really have the efforts, the projects, the investments that many donors are making in the Caribbean. Are they actually improving the state of the marine environment? Are they reducing on the pollutant loads into the environment? So I would say work in progress, still challenging. But I think now that we've had an agreement as to what each government is committed to share and to provide that data freely for us as a secretariat to compile and then present it in a way that doesn't criticize governments if they're not up to scratch in terms of their efforts, but rather in a proactive way that allows them then to hopefully improve in their pollution prevention measures.
As we try to ask the question, what are the right kind of data sharing mechanisms, the institutional arrangements that might be needed globally to improve or close the marine pollution data gap? What do you feel the sort of learnings of the Cartagena Convention and all of the work that you've done are from a global perspective on marine pollution and particularly closing the marine pollution data gap?
It's really critical that as we look at the whole aspect of data and information, I think we have to recognize those different levels at which that data and information is needed and is useful. We've certainly seen value at a very, very local and community scale to engage citizen science, to give them a forum where their data at a very local or national level is very important from the standpoint of national decision making. Then you look at a region like the Caribbean, where there is need to have an understanding of what's happening as pollution moves through the Caribbean Sea. In some cases, the pollution is coming from outside of the region, across the Atlantic. And that's where a lot of those global connections take place. And in reality, some of the science and the expertise in terms of modeling, in terms of projection, and in terms of global data sets are really set at the global level. And I think as we develop these data and information platforms, we need to make use of those global data sets, but recognize where that data allows an opportunity for certain regional sort of refinement, regionalization, maybe in some cases verification of some of those global data models.
Chris Corbin, coordinator at the Cartagena Convention Secretariat for the United Nations Environment Programme. Thank you.
Thank you so much.